Assalamu alaikum. Today's lecture will be about the adrenocortical hormones. Your recommended chapter in IdiTEN textbook is chapter 78. As you already know that there are two adrenal glands, 4 grams each, and they are located at the superior pole of the kidneys. The adrenal composed of two parts, the adrenal cortex, the outer part, and the inner part, the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, which is around 20% of the whole adrenal gland, and it is related to sympathetic nervous system and secretes mainly epinephrine and norepinephrine, so mainly the function similar to sympathetic nervous system. The adrenocortical hormones, from the name, these are hormones that is secreted from the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex here synthesize and secrete variety of steroids hormones named corticosteroids. These hormones synthesize from steroid cholesterol. So all these enzymes, the primary substrate for them is cholesterol. Functionally, these hormones, the corticosteroids, can be categorized into 3 groups. The first group called mineralocorticoids. The second one is glucocorticoids, and the third one is adrenal androgens. The first group, the mineralocorticoids, from the name. So it is named because it affects the blood electrolytes or the minerals. And the most important hormone in this group, and which we will discuss, is aldosterone. The second group, also from the name, glucose. So it mainly affects the glucose glucose level. And the most important one is cortisol. The adrenal androgen, also from the name, we already know that the androgen secreted from the gonads, but here also the adrenal cortex secrete low amount of androgens. That's why they are called adrenal androgen. And the physiologically most important one is the DHEA and the androstenedione. Histologically, if we have a cross-section over the adrenal cortex, the first layer after the capsule called zona glomerulosa, which is around 15% of the total height of the adrenal cortex, and it secretes the mineralocorticoids, which is the aldosterone, because it contains some enzymes that synthesize aldosterone, like aldosterone synthase. The second layer is zona vesiculata, which is the most abundant layer here. It's around 75% of the height of the adrenal cortex, and it secretes the glucocorticoids. The most important one is the cortisol. And the deepest layer is zona reticularis, and this is the one which secretes the adrenal androgens, the DHEA and the androstenedione. How these adrenocortical hormones synthesize and secreted. As we said already, all these hormones are steroids that derived primarily from cholesterol. So from where the cholesterol come to these cells, very little amount synthesized de novo, which is inside the cells. The majority of the cholesterol, which is around the 80%, comes from the blood, from the low density lipoproteins. So the transport of glucose to these cells to synthesize these hormones regulated by a feedback mechanism that control the level of these hormones. Once the cholesterol enter the cell, it will be delivered to mitochondria, and there it will be cleaved by an enzyme called cholesterol dismolase, which then will be converted to pregnenolone. And this is the rate limiting step, the most important step, where most of the regulation of these hormones will exert its effects in this step. So this initial step, as I said, is stimulated by different factors that control the secretion of these major hormones. They say, for example, the secretion of cortisol is controlled by the level of ACTH. So how much ACTH will stimulate this step will control the level of the hormone. So as you see from this slide, so the cholesterol will be delivered to the cells, either, as we said, de novo, or through the circulation in LDL. Once it is there in the mitochondria, it will be metabolized by the enzyme cholesterol dismolase to form pregnenolone. This step, as we said, is the rate limiting step, and it is available in all the zones, and this is the step which is regulated by the different factors that control the level of these hormones, like, for example, the ACTH, which increase the secretion of cortisol, or the angiotensin II, which stimulate the secretion of aldosterone. So once this pregnenolone is formed, there will be successive enzymatic reactions here, and like in zona granulosa, it will produce aldosterone because it contains the enzyme aldosterone synthase, while in the zona fasciculata, it will the enzymatic reaction will produce cortisol, while the zona granulosa, the last layer, they will produce the androgens, the DHEA, and the androstenedione. So all these hormones are steroids derived from cholesterol. The adrenocortical hormones, once they are produced by the adrenal cortex cell, they are released immediately to the circulation. They are not stored. Once they are released, they will be bound to plasma proteins. 90 to 95% of the cortisol in the plasma will be bound to proteins, especially the cortisol binding globulin or transcorrin, and to a very lesser extent to albumin. That's why the cortisol have a long half-life, because of this high degree of binding to plasma protein. So their elimination from the plasma will be slow. While the aldosterone, only 60%, around 60% of it will be bound to plasma protein, and the rest 40% will be free. And also this explains why it has shorter half-life, which is around 20 minutes compared to cortisol. So the adrenocortical hormones usually metabolized in the liver. So they will be degraded by the hepatocytes through conjugation. Especially they will be conjugated to gluconic acid and to a lesser extent to sulfate. Once it is conjugated, around 25% of them will be excreted in the bile through the then in the feces, and the remaining conjugates, they will enter the circulation, but they are not bound to plasma protein. They are really soluble in the plasma. That's why they will get filtered in the kidneys and excreted in the urine. Let's now talk about the first group, which is the mineralocorticoids, and we said the most important one is aldosterone. What are the functions of aldosterone? It increases renal sodium reabsorption. It has receptors on the principal cells of the late distal tubule and collecting duct. So once it binds to the receptors, it will increase the renal sodium reabsorption. It also increases renal potassium secretion, so more loss of potassium in the urine, again by the action on principal cell of the late distal tubule and collecting duct. Also, it increases renal hydrogen secretion, which is loss of acid in the urine. This through the action on alpha intercalated cells, which are located in the late distal tubule and collecting duct. Also, aldosterone affects sweat glands and salivary glands and intestinal epithelial cell by stimulating sodium and potassium transport in the ductal cells of these glands. So again, it will increase sodium reabsorption and increase potassium secretion by these ductal cells. And aldosterone is, the effect of aldosterone is as we said, it will increase the reabsorption of sodium chloride and the secretion of the potassium by these ductal cells. And this effect on sweat glands is very important, especially in hot weather where the body need to preserve the water and the salt. So the body will not lose too much water, especially as we said in the hot weather, either both in the saliva or in the sweat. What happens when you have high aldosterone level? If you recall the functions of aldosterone, you will know what will be the consequences if the level of aldosterone is increased. So just spend 2 minutes to figure out what will be the effect on the sodium, on the potassium, on the hydrogen, and what are the related consequences of these electrolytes imbalance. There will be an increase in the extracellular fluid volume. Why is that? Because aldosterone will increase sodium reabsorption. Once you increase sodium reabsorption, the water will follow by osmosis. So here there will be an increase in extracellular fluid volume, increase in blood volume, and this will cause an increase in arterial blood pressure. What about the plasma sodium concentration? Will it be increased? Here the effect will be very minimal. It might be normal or very slightly increased, because when the aldosterone increase the sodium reabsorption, what we said, the water will follow. So the level of sodium concentration will not be increased. And even if there is a slight increase in sodium concentration, this will stimulate our thirst center and the secretion of ADH, which will increase the water intake to normalize the osmolality of the blood. What you can see from this figure, if we give an aldosterone injection here to a person, what will happen? What we said, the extracellular volume will be increased, which is increase in blood volume, which will increase in the blood pressure. And we are expecting the urinary sodium concentration to be reduced, and it will be reduced immediately. However, it will be normalized later on. Why is that? If you recall from urinary lectures, if there is an increase in blood pressure, there will be an effect on the kidney called pressure diuresis. There will be more sodium and more water filtered by the by the glomeruli, and it will be excreted in the urine. So if the aldosterone level continue to be high, there will be an increase in blood pressure, which will cause both pressure diuresis and pressure natriuresis. So the sodium retention by the body will not be there, because of these two effects, it will be secreted into the urine. And this is what we call aldosterone escape phenomena. And I already mentioned about hypernatremia. It will not be a problem here, because as we said, the sodium, the water will follow. Also, if we have a high aldosterone concentration, we'll have hypokalemia, because now a lot of potassium will be secreted in the urine, and this might cause muscle weakness, because it will affect the stability of the membrane potentials. Also, aldosterone, we said it will increase the tubular hydrogen ion secretion, so we are losing acid in the urine, and this will cause alkalosis. Okay, what will happen if we have low aldosterone secretion? Just the opposite of what we had in the high aldosterone. So here there will be hyperkalemia, and this is have a major cardiac effect, and it causes cardiac toxicity, which has to be corrected immediately. Also, there will be an increased loss of sodium and water from the body, because now the aldosterone is not there, so there will be reduced sodium reabsorption by the renal tubules, and once you lose sodium in the urine, and the water will follow because of osmosis, and this consequently what it will do, it will reduce the blood volume, low cardiac output, and maybe the person will have hypovolemic shock. That's why these cases need to be urgently treated with aldosterone, because we consider it as an acute life-saving hormone. How aldosterone is regulated? I'm sure 100% you're familiar with this diagram already. So if we have a conditions of low blood volume because of dehydration, sodium deficiency, or hemorrhage, there will be a reduction in the blood volume, which will cause a reduction in blood pressure, and this will be sensed by the juxtaglomerular cells of the kidney, which will secrete renin, and this renin will convert angiotensinogen produced by the liver to angiotensin 1, and then by the enzyme angiotensin converting enzyme, it will be converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is the one which will go and stimulate the cells of the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone by we said it will stimulate the first step of conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone, and also it will stimulate aldosterone synthase enzyme that will produce aldosterone, which will go and cause the effect of increasing sodium and water reabsorption, which will increase the blood volume, and it will normalize the blood pressure. Okay, so one of the things that stimulate aldosterone is angiotensin 2 through this pathway, which is renin angiotensin aldosterone pathway. So as I said, angiotensin 2 will accelerate the conversion of cholesterol to pregnenolone and the deoxycortisone to aldosterone by stimulating the aldosterone synthase. The second factor that affect aldosterone secretion is the potassium ion concentration. So any increase, even 10% increase in potassium concentration, will stimulate the synthesis and release of aldosterone, which is completely independent of the previous pathway we said, which is the renin-angiotensin pathway. So any change in potassium level will stimulate aldosterone secretion. So potassium concentration increase will also increase the cholesterol conversion to pregnenolone, the rate limiting step we talked about it, which will increase the conversion also of deoxycorticosterone to aldosterone. Another factor that control aldosterone is the level of adrenocortical hormone, which is released from anterior pituitary gland. The ACTH actually has a permissive role on aldosterone regulation, which means that we need a small amount of ACTH to cause aldosterone secretion, because in cases of total absence of ACTH, this will significantly reduce aldosterone secretion. That's why we said it is a permissive role. The fourth factor affecting the aldosterone secretion is increase in sodium ion concentration. So increase in sodium ion concentration will very slightly decrease the aldosterone secretion. From these four factors, I can tell you the most important two factors are the potassium concentration and the angiotensin II hormone. So these two main factors that have a major effect on aldosterone secretion. What is the mechanism of action of aldosterone? You know that the aldosterone is a steroid hormone, so it can go through the cell membrane. The receptors, mineralocorticoid receptor found inside the cell, inside the cytoplasm. Once it's complexed with the hormone, so this is the hormone receptor complex, it will diffuse inside the nucleus, which then will induce one or two or some specific regions in the DNA, which will result in formation of new messenger RNA, which then it will go and diffuse into cytoplasm, and in conjunction with the ribosomes, it will form new proteins. Some of these proteins are related to the potassium sodium pump in the basolateral membrane of the tubular cells, which will increase the potassium reabsorption inside the cell. And also some of these proteins is the epithelial sodium channels in the luminal membrane of the tubular cell, which also will enable loss of reabsorption of the sodium. So if you see here the effect of aldosterone, because it induces some areas in the DNA, formation of new proteins, so the effect is not immediate. So this sequence of events might take 30 minutes for the new messenger RNAs to be formed, and another 45 minutes for these new proteins to become functional, which then affect the sodium and the potassium levels, which might take even to peak up within many hours. Okay, so now let's talk about the second group of adrenocortical hormones, which is the glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids, 95% of glucocorticoid activity results from the secretion of cortisol, which is also known as hydrocortisone. So cortisol, hydrocortisone are more or less similar. Small but very significant amount of glucocorticoid activity is provided by another one called corticosterone. What is the mechanism of action of cortisol? So as we said, cortisol is also a steroid, so the receptor will be found in the cytoplasm, so it will combine to this cytosol receptor, which then will form the hormone receptor complex, which will go into the nucleus, which then will bind to specific areas in the DNA and induce transcription of some of the areas, which will result in formation of new messenger RNA and new proteins in the cytoplasm, which will cause the effect of glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids, the cortisol, has effects on metabolism. It also considers one of the important stress hormones that is released during stressful conditions to the body. And also it has an important anti-inflammatory effect. What is the effect of cortisol on carbohydrate metabolism? You can consider cortisol as a hyperglycemic hormone, which means it increases the level of blood glucose. Cortisol causes stimulation of gluconeogenesis, which is formation of new glucose by the liver, and this is through different mechanisms. First of them is by increasing and enhancing the liver enzymes which convert amino acids to glucose. At the same time, it causes mobilization of amino acids from extrahepatic tissue, mainly the muscles, which then can be used by the liver to synthesize new glucose. And also, if you see here, it is almost antagonizing the insulin effect by stimulating the gluconeogenesis. At the same time, also it facilitates the effect of glucagon. If you recall, glucagon also stimulates gluconeogenesis and increase blood glucose level and cause hyperglycemia. Also, cortisone has been found to decrease the glucose uptake and its utilization by the cell. The exact mechanism is not well defined, but what has been found that cortisol have some sort of cause some sort of insulin resistance by decreasing the translocation of the glucose transporter 4, and also by decreasing the expression of, if you remember from our last lecture, insulin receptor substrates group 1, which are necessary in mediating the insulin action. So at the end, cortisol will cause an increase in blood glucose level. That's why it is labeled as a hyperglycemic hormone. What is adrenal diabetes? If there is any pathological condition that causes an increase in cortisol level, this will cause hyperglycemia, increase in blood glucose level, because of the mechanisms we just talked about in the previous slide. So increase in blood glucose level is one of the strong stimuli for the beta cells to secrete insulin. So if there is an increase in blood glucose level, there will be a stimulation of beta cells to secrete insulin. However, the insulin here will not be able to correct the condition. Why? If you remember, also the mechanism we talked about it in the previous slide, that there will be some sort of insulin resistance because of cortisol effect. There will be no GLUT4 expression, there will be reduction in expression of these insulin receptor substrates. So if this hyperglycemia continue to be there, the beta cell will try to secrete insulin, and by the end it will cause beta cell exhaustion, and the picture of diabetes will appear on that patient. Okay, so here, because of both, there will be a high cortisol level, and also the insulin cannot correct it, and the beta cell will be exhausted to secrete. What is the effect of cortisol on protein metabolism? It will cause reduction in cellular proteins in almost all cells of the body except the liver cells. How is that? The cortisol will promote protein breakdown, protein catabolism, and at the same time decrease protein synthesis in extrahepatic tissue, especially the muscle. And this is mainly because it reduces the transport of amino acid to these extrahepatic tissue. So it will cause breakdown of the protein. At the same time, there is no much of new protein will be formed. It increases protein synthesis in the liver, which including different enzymes in the liver, and also different types of plasma proteins. And this increase in protein synthesis of the liver because of an increase in the transport of amino acid to the liver, which then will be used to synthesize these proteins. At the same time, also it increases the synthesis of RNAs and new proteins in the liver. Also, cortisol, as I mentioned before, it increases the level of blood amino acid, and this is mainly because of catabolism of the protein in the extrahepatic tissue. Also, it decreases the transport of amino acid to this extrahepatic tissue and increase their transport to hepatic cells, so to increase the liver proteins synthesis. So if there is any pathological effect that causes high cortisol level for a longer time, this might affect the muscles and it might cause muscle weakness in this patient, because now the protein in this muscle will be catabolized, it will be break down, and there will be less of new protein formed there. What is the effect of cortisol and fat metabolism? It is more or less similar to what is happening with proteins. It increases the mobilization of fatty acids from the adipose tissue. So it increases the mobilization, which will increase the concentration of fatty acids in the plasma, which then it will increase their utilization as an energy source. For example, during starvation, when there is no glucose as an energy, so here the cortisol, because it's one of the stress hormones, it will be released, and this will cause the cells to use fatty acid as a source of energy. Also, it has like a direct effect on increasing the oxidation of fatty acids to produce energy. Abnormally with the cortisol and fat metabolism, that it causes lipolysis in some areas and mobilization of fatty acid, but in some areas it causes more of a fat deposition, especially in the head and the chest area. So that's why patients who have high cortisol level secretion, they will have something called buffalo torso, which is deposition of the fat at the back of the neck, which is similar to buffalo shape. Also, deposition of fat in some areas like the chest and even the face, they will have something called moon face. The exact mechanism of this is not well clear, but these are one of the distinct features for people. What is the effect of glucocorticoids on blood and immunity? Cortisol causes increase in erythropoiesis and neutrophil and platelet count. And in opposite, it reduces the number of lymphocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. That's why in pathological conditions where there is a high increase of cortisol secretion, patients will have eosinopenia, which is a reduction in number of eosinophils, and lymphocytopenia. Also, patients who have high cortisol secretion, they will have polycythemia because of an increase in erythropoiesis. In contrary, patients who have low cortisol secretion, usually they will be presented with anemia because of the reduction in erythropoiesis. Glucocorticoids, when they are present in the body in a high level, it has some anti-inflammatory effects. You already know that the inflammatory response is like a defense mechanism for the body to get rid of any microbes invading it, or also when it is exposed to injury. So once there is an invading microbe or an injury to a vessel, this will cause inflammatory response. If you recall it from your previous study, there are different cascades of events will happen that will cause the inflammatory response. Some of these inflammations might continue for a long time, like in chronic infections, which is doing harmful to the body than good. And also if it happen in unwanted places, it must also cause harm for the body. And that's why glucocorticoids or cortisol can be used as an anti-inflammatory, as a therapy, because of its characteristics of anti-inflammatory response to reduce such inflammatory unwanted responses. So the glucocorticoid doing this by blocking the early stages of inflammation, and if the inflammation already happened, it will cause a rapid resolution of inflammation, and also it will increase the healing. And this is the rationale why they use it in some inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and diseases like that. Also, it is the same reason why they also giving it to some allergic conditions like asthma and some sort of eczema, because it reduces the inflammatory responses. What are the mechanisms of these anti-inflammatory responses of the glucocorticoids? What they will do, they will cause stabilization of lysosomal membranes, and once these membranes are stabilized, there will be a reduction in proteolytic enzymes release. So this will reduce the inflammatory process. Also, it reduces the capillary permeability. It reduces the white blood cells migration and their phagocytic action. Also, it suppresses the T lymphocytes activity in general, so it will reduce the immunity, and I will speak in more detail about this later on. Also, it reduces the release of interleukin-1, and you already know this interleukin-1, the one which goes to the hypothalamus and increase the temperature, and this is the reason why steroids have antipyretic effects, so it reduces the fever. So as I mentioned before, so glucocorticoids in high doses might cause immunosuppression, and this by decreasing the number of circulating T lymphocytes. So this happened because of suppression of the proliferation of T lymphocytes and the lymphoid tissue, especially in the lymph nodes and the thymus. So here the glucocorticoids also found to prevent the release of interleukin-2 by T lymphocytes, which is an important cytokine for T cell proliferation, differentiation, and homeostasis. So if there is any pathological condition that there is a hypersecretion or an excess use of glucocorticoids, definitely that patient will have a decrease in the immune response and immune reactions against all foreign bodies that enter the body. And this have a side effects, because if the body cannot fight the infections, it might cause severe infection which might lead to death. However, at the same time, this immunosuppressive effect of glucocorticoids can be used as a therapy for transplant patients, because there is definitely some immunological reactions during organ transplantation, because these are like a foreign bodies into the body and might cause rejection of this transplanted tissue. The use of glucocorticoids in these patients will suppress the immunological reactions and will reduce the risk of rejection of the transplanted tissue. So in this diagram, so just a summary of the previous slide, but you have to keep in mind that glucocorticoids or cortisol normal physiological concentration has no much effect on the immunity of the body. Only when it is given in a high doses for some type of treatment, so in a therapeutic doses where the cortisol concentration is increased, this will cause atrophy of the lymphoid tissue, and which will reduce the output of sensitized lymphocytes and antibodies, which is an important part of the immune system. So there will be a suppression of the immune response. As we said, this might have a beneficial effect for treatment, which will reduce the chances of rejection in transplanted patients. So it is useful in prevention of rejection of transplanted organs and grafts, but at the same time it carry a risk of increasing the susceptibility to infections. That's why these patients who are given steroid treatment, especially for organ transfer, because they are given a lot of steroids, usually they keep them in isolated room. They don't eat uncooked food, just to reduce the chances of getting an infection from anywhere. Cortisol is considered as one of the important stress hormones. So any stress, it can be a physical stress like trauma or injury, severe injury. It can be chemical stress like severe hypoxemia, severe acid-base imbalance, or even an emotional stress like some psychological trauma or anything. This will affect our hypothalamus, which then will secrete different hormones like vasopressin, like activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and the effect of a sympathetic, as you already know, on insulin and glucagon and on blood vessels. And also it will affect the pituitary by increasing corticotropin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH, which then will cause the adrenal cortex to secrete more of cortisol. And if you review the cortisol effect, it's more of like providing glucose for the vital organs like the brain by the process of gluconeogenesis. At the same time, it causes mobilization of fat and amino acids, and also it increases the utilization of fatty acid for energy for the other cells. So it's one of the important stress. Also, the cortisol, if it is given for a long time, it might have some effects on the stomach. It increases the gastric flow and acid secretion. It decreases the gastric mucosal proliferation, which these two factors might cause or increase the chances of getting peptic ulcer. Also, cortisol or glucocorticoids might cause in high doses because personality changes like loss of concentration, irritability, psychiatric manifestations. One of the important, we can consider it as a side effect for patients who are treated with cortisol, is the anti-growth effect. This is especially with children. So children who receive a course of steroid treatment for longer time, they have a risk of affecting their growth, because cortisol found to have an inhibitory effect on growth hormone secretion, because it affects the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So in children, as I told you, the clinicians should be really careful when they administer steroids for longer time for these kids. Also, cortisol in their physiological doses, they have very mild mineralocorticoid action. I mean by mineralocorticoid action is action similar to aldosterone. However, patients who are treated with steroids and when there is a high secretion of cortisol, the mineralocorticoid activity becomes really significant, and the hypertension might develop because there will be an increased reabsorption of sodium. And this, as we discussed before, blood pressure might be increased. How the body controlled glucocorticoid secretions. It is the classic negative feedback mechanism you know about before. So as you already know that the hypothalamus receive information from many areas in the brain, the limbic system, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and also different stressors that affect the body also send signals to hypothalamus, which will secrete corticotropin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete ACTH, which then will go and stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete corticols and other glucocorticoids. So the level of cortisol here will control how much to be secreted. So if we have a high level of cortisol, this will send negative feedback impulses to inhibit ACTH secretion by the pituitary and also inhibit the CRH secretion by the hypothalamus to normalize the level of cortisol. The glucocorticoid secretion exhibit a circadian rhythm. What I mean by circadian rhythm, if you see in this graph, the secretion is higher during the daytime and lower during the night time. So cortisol level, as I said, high in the early morning time and low in the late evening time. And this is mainly from the effect of 24-hour cyclical alteration in signals from the hypothalamus that will cause cortisol secretion. So the day and time circadian rhythm affect the glucocorticoid secretion. And why this is important to be known? From clinical point of view, when you request to measure cortisol, you have to know the time of taking the sample, and also it is better to take two samples, one during the early morning 6 a.m. and one during the evening like 6 p.m. so you can judge about the level of cortisol. This is all about adrenal cortex hormones, so I hope everything is clear. Please refer to your guide to textbook, and if you have any queries, don't hesitate to email me. Thank you very much.